on how U.S. Catholicism is being transformed by new kinds of leadership, learning, and institutional life. Today's panel is titled The Future of Community and Sacramental Life, a topic that has perhaps acquired some added urgency over these challenging months. We'll hear more about the session and participants in just a moment. First, I want to remind everyone that all of the conversations in this series are available for viewing on YouTube if you haven't been able to attend live or would like to watch again. And since this is our final gathering, I also want to use the occasion once more to thank our 2020 Catholic in the Public Square Award honorees, Carrie A. Robinson of Leadership Roundtable, and Amy R. Goldman, CEO and Chair of GHR Foundation, who were instrumental in helping us put this series together and who also very generously agreed to host the first two conversations. We're hoping we can see as many of you as possible next October when we plan to gather for our Commonweal Catholic in the Public Square Award dinner in New York to honor Carrie and Amy in person. Now, I'm very happy to have with us today as the moderator of our panel, Claudia Avila Cosnahan. Claudia is Director of Evangelization at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in downtown Los Angeles. She serves the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and surrounding dioceses as a frequent retreat leader and speaker and instructor for adult formation programs. As the vice moderator for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles Pastoral Council and the moderator for the Our Lady of the Angels Region Pastoral Council, she offers consultation on various topics affecting the local community, and she's also a consultant for Commonweal magazine. In a moment, Claudia will introduce you to our featured speakers, but let me first offer a final friendly reminder about our Commonweal events. They are free and open to the public, and they would not be possible without our readers and subscribers. The support and encouragement we get from friends and readers of Commonweal are indispensable. So if our independent, lay-run voice matters to you, we invite you to support us with a tax-deductible donation. Just see the donate link in the chat feature or go to our website. You can also continue to be a part of our conversation by subscribing to the magazine, listening to our podcast, and following us on social media. Your help is a big part in everything we do. I also have to give one more big shout out to the folks at Commonweal who've put this series of events together, especially our audience development team, Milton Javier Bravo, Gabriella Wilkie, and Adriana Melnick, along with our publisher, Tom Baker. And finally, let me thank those who've agreed to take part today, our moderator and our panelists, and all of you who are joining us. So now, without further ado, I hand things over to Claudia.
Thank you, Dominic. It's my pleasure to be here with everyone. And it's my pleasure to be here with everyone. And I want to welcome all of you who are gathered with us from your homes or from work, wherever you may be. It's an honor to share this hour with you, and it's an honor to share this hour with our panelists. Today, we're gathered with Naomi Deanda, Associate Professor of Religious Studies from the University of Dayton, with Brett Hoover, Associate Professor of Theological Studies, Loyola Marymount University, and Natalia Imperatori Lee, Professor of Religious Studies, Manhattan College. And finally, Darius Villalobos. He is the director at the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry. And so I'll begin our conversation immediately. We only share an hour together, and I'm sure it's going to go by so quickly because this is such an important topic affecting the church, especially in these difficult times. And so it's hard to believe that approximately 7 months ago, the coronavirus pandemic hit the US. This marked the beginning of parish closures, specifically the sudden halt of all in-person parish ministerial activity, a pause on the celebration of sacraments in some regions, and a rush to make the celebrations of the Mass available through live streams. I know that happened very quickly here in Los Angeles. So I'm wondering, and I'm sure many of us are wondering and would like to hear from our panelists today, what has this crisis revealed in regard to our explicit and our implicit beliefs about the role of the parish in the mission of the church and our communal life and even our sacramental life? I'll open it up to whoever would like to share first, and then the rest of you may respond.
Well, I can jump in first. Two observations that I've really seen in the life of my own parish have been one, how fragile parish life really is. When this first started, we were really challenged in my local community here in Chicago with the reality that my pastor had gone out of the country to visit his family in Kenya, and he was not allowed to come back into the United States until August. He's the only priest in our parish, and so our deacon, who is well into his 70s, had to step in so many ways to help lead the parish spiritually, but we also had a gap of leadership, and it really showed some of the flaws that we have in our parish structures and organization, where there wasn't a clear sense of who was going to step into that role of leading and making decisions and really guiding parish life. The second thing, it really showed that there's a fundamental flaw in some of our parishes where we have a hard time being church outside of church, or being church outside of our four walls. And I think what this really called many communities to have to look into is, how can we be creative in reaching our parishioners and reaching our local community? And how can we think more broadly about the social needs that our communities are being called to serve? The reality is, one of our ministries is a food pantry. We were definitely serving well beyond our borders and our boundaries during this time of pandemic. And so many people were in need of food and support, but we were limited in our scope and what we can do and who we can offer it to. And so I think for me, fundamentally, the thing that I was challenged by was to really look at how our parishes are structured, who has leadership and who feels called to lead, especially when there is a crisis, when there is an emergency there, and that feeling of not always being adequate enough in our preparation to respond to those challenges and to those times of uncertainty.
Thank you, Darius.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on some of the things that Darius said, which are really just spot on, I think. For me, looking at this from in the Northeast, in the Bronx, it's been apocalyptic in that the virus has, or the quarantine, the effects of the virus have revealed a lot, right? There's been a peeling away of a lot of the fictions that we had about the resilience of our church, about shared governance, about what it means to be a community that we call a church. So I think of the things that it's revealed, it reveals that revenue streams are problematic for parishes without mass, that we need money. And the only way that we get money is through in-person worship, then that's going to be a really big problem moving forward. It's revealed to me also that a lot of ordained ministers are at a loss. They experience a kind of desolation when they don't have a sacramental ministry to do. But to go along with that, you get a lot of neglect of parishioners. So I have friends of mine, soccer mothers, that's the official name for soccer moms, the soccer mothers who are catechists who did not hear from their pastors. I haven't heard from them in 7 months. Not a phone call, not an "Are you all alive?" Nothing. So there's a real sort of lack of ministry outside of sacramental ministry. And the third thing that is revealed in this overlap with racial justice rallies and also with the election season is really the kind of horrifically bad conscience formation that is going on in many of our parishes, and whose voices are getting heard in that. So it reveals those things. It intensifies some of our tendencies, right? Our polarizing tendencies, because now we can shop for mass on a global mall, not just in a local, like what you can drive to, because we can go to any live stream. It also intensifies that border crossing that I think Darius was talking about, where parishes are working outside of their borders, but also individual Catholics are moving beyond their borders. One of our cousins found the priest from Venezuela that she liked when she lived in New York, and now she lives in Seattle, but she can still go to his mass. And she was actually really consoled by that. And then the last thing is, I think it's inviting us to new possibilities, right? And the new possibilities that I'm seeing are possibilities for the return of the parish as a hub of social service, which it has been in the United States in the past, right? As a place where people go for mental health, for AA, not just for sacramental ministry, but, you know, why aren't we hosting learning hubs or, you know, school pods and things like that in these buildings that could really sort of help people through difficult times? And also, the second possibility that I hope it brings up is possibilities for really shared governance. Because what Darius said is really true, right? If the pastor is gone or sick or in quarantine, and that leaves the entire parish in a lurch, then we really need a better model.
For me, this is an interesting question because as an adult, I've never been a parish Catholic. I've always, since I was 18, I've been a member of a Marianist lay community, and that has been my official church. So the shift for that we experienced starting in March and are still living out has made me feel like more of a central Catholic than I have in years. So this is really an interesting shift to think about some of the other places Catholicism lives outside of parishes, when so much focus has been both on parishes and on the hierarchical leadership that frames that parish model. So I think that's one thing to think about, is that like both Natalia and Daria said, it's important to think about what is the leadership and shared leadership or discipleship of equals that we may be called to, as well as where are the places that people have been practicing Catholicism in very different ways for thousands of years. And so I think we have models that have never stopped existing, but sometimes we set up our walls. And I'm so excited you said walls, Darius, because I have that in my notes. Like I have my little main points here. And this afternoon, I was just thinking, wow, it's so fascinating to think about. I'm from El Paso, so the wall is central, and I almost wore my walls t-shirt. But it's central to what I'm thinking all the time. But then thinking about the walls of our buildings and which buildings we have. So not just parish buildings, but also school buildings, institutions of higher ed, Catholic hospitals, Catholic charities. So those are the other pieces of not just how are we practicing Catholicism, but how is Catholicism infiltrating into society and forming society and social existence. So I looked up a couple of things, and Catholic hospitals serve at least 1 in 7 people in the USA every single day. And along with that goes everything that has to do with main Catholic teaching, for better and for worse. So there's all kinds of stuff on that, and that might be a whole other conversation to be had. But it's just interesting to me to think about that, Catholic charities, Catholic social services, all of the places that, and yes, Darius and Natalia are very right, parishes have opened up very broadly. But also, what are the other places that have had to ramp up from Catholic backgrounds, Catholic perspectives, Catholic identity to attend to what is happening now?
Gosh, I feel I'm so impressed with my colleagues' comments here, and so I probably won't have too much to say, except that as a student of parish life, I've noticed over the last 20 years or so how the kind of theology of the new evangelization has had a very big impact in a lot of parishes. Focusing attention on liturgical participation and parish involvement is kind of the big markers of being a totally evangelized Catholic. And I think this has revealed the shortcomings of that. There might be many good things about that. And I think about how this also sometimes affects parish renewal programs that seem to focus their attention there. A lot of them, most of them, maybe all of them. and also the way it can kind of dovetail in a strange way with old notions that people have about if you don't attend Sunday Mass, that it's a mortal sin. And so my students, my graduate students who are mostly pastoral ministers, come and tell me about people that are absolutely lost without being able to come to Sunday Mass, or because they're afraid because of their particular sensitivities or vulnerabilities. And even people who are angry here in Los Angeles when the churches didn't open right away, and you know, and saw it in terms of their basic rights as Catholics were being violated. I think it really opened up all that, and it showed us that we're a bit compartmentalized, and my colleagues have been talking about this sometimes in our faith. And I think of what Naomi just said about some of the wonderful things that are happening in places other than parishes. But we really need in our parish life to be helping, kind of equipping people to be Catholics in their work and at home, and not to compartmentalize the faith so much. I wonder sometimes if a lot of us as Catholics, and maybe this afflicts us white Catholics more, but if we even know how to pray outside of liturgy.
Thank you. You're all raising such important points. I feel like we could have a whole other session just to talk about each of them. But I think I want to attempt to look at them a little further. You know, in the past 4 weeks, this series has been titled Reimagining U.S. Catholicism Today. And it's invited us to reimagine how Catholic institutions have been transformed and to think about what needs to change in order to support the change. And you've all already began to allude to that, right? You've touched on our, you know, the tradition of how even parishes handle their finances and what they're dependent on. How we are perhaps neglecting parishioners in this time due to the pandemic, and how that's been revealed, right? And even how we share leadership. And I'm really struck by some of the things that were said. You know, you guys said that to imagine the parish as a hub of social service. And to me, that was kind of a bomb that's been, that maybe for some might explode in the middle of what they usually do, right? Like to think of the parish in those terms. So I'm wondering, what do you guys think, what kind of transformation is actually required? If you can kind of go a little deeper into that. Even in regards to the leadership in our particular practices.
I think what Brett was saying about the new evangelization, making mass going as the sort of central pillar of good Catholicism, is a great place to start in terms of transformation. As Naomi said, there are thousands of Catholics in this country and throughout the Americas for whom mass going is virtually impossible because of lack of priests and rural location and lack of interest by the church in having sort of mass available to non-white Catholics. And so the idea that one's goodness as a Catholic, or one's Catholic sort of chops or props, I forget the word, but whatever, your Catholic credentials rest entirely on this Sunday obligation, really does cause people to have a lot of stress when the Sunday obligation is out of the question, right? So I wonder if we need a reappropriation of the word Eucharist, right? When Vatican II says that the Eucharist is the summit and the source of the Christian life, do they mean Mass? Or did they mean some sort of a sharing of life that is taking part in the way that God shared God's life with us? I think that we've made the Eucharist too small by locating it only in the Sunday Mass. And I wonder if a more expansive idea of what it means to be a Eucharistic church outside of the parish, outside of those walls that Naomi was talking about, I wonder if that more expansive view is a good place to start.
That's great, Natalia. And I really, one of the things that's been coming back to me during this time is the you know, what is sometimes called in the Hebrew prophets, the anti-cultus, you know, this you know, kind of prophetic, direct, you know, these prophetic comments directed at the people because they're spending so much of their energy and time on ritual observance and on worship, but neglecting their responsibilities to one another or to the poor or to the marginal, to the stranger. And I think, again, some of this is not our fault, right? It's the compartmentalization of our society that we break everything into little boxes, and religion is one of those boxes. But yeah, I think, I mean, to me, that was a great comfort to think about those texts calling us to let our Catholic faith suffuse all of our lives, to to let the Eucharist be something, yes, that's important to us. It's important to me in terms of Mass going, but also something that is in every part of my life, where I feel my creatureliness, my thanksgiving to God, the word Eucharist meaning thanksgiving, and I'm using that experience of love and mercy from God to share that love and mercy with everyone else, again, in work or in my family life or in my service of strangers, immigrants, and the poor.
Two things that really stand out to me has been in relationship to who is leading in many ways in parishes and who has had to step up during this time into key roles. And so being blessed to work with a lot of youth ministers, it's been actually really funny to see the number of youth ministers who have taken on additional responsibilities in these past 7 months. The most common being the person in charge of the live stream and tech and communications and social media, and all of these things that were once considered kind of secondary or extra have now become essential roles for parish life. But I think with that, we still have not treated those ministers, those individual leaders, as being essential players. In many dioceses, we've seen cuts and cutbacks. Many parishes have let go of some of those people who were kind of the ones who helped us get through the worst parts of this. And so I'm feeling particularly challenged to say, both from a practical but also a justice perspective, how do we create safe spaces for our lay ministry leaders to both be recognized for the gifts and tools that they bring to do this pastoral ministry work, but also how do we protect them so that they are not the first ones on the chopping block when we have to make these really difficult decisions around finances. And more so than ever, I think we really need to lean on the creativity and gifts of young people during this moment, because they know how to meet our communities where they're at. They're living and swimming and breathing in these worlds that many of our traditional pastoral ministers are not comfortable with yet, particularly clergy, or are just not equipped to figure out how to use those most effectively. And so I think that's a huge piece. The other thing too is I think we have to recognize that if we have not engaged our communities during this time, there is a huge lack of trust. There is a lack of sense of connection and belonging. And in many different ways, the church has struggled with trust issues over the years. But I think in this process of kind of reinventing parishes or reimagining what parishes can be or should be, none of that matters if your community doesn't trust you. And so I think part of what we have to do is invest in really rebuilding goodwill and relationships with those who felt alone or ignored or left out during this time because they weren't able to get that phone call from their pastor or get that check-in from somebody from the parish office, or even access the liturgy or resources that we provide because we weren't able or creative enough to do that.
I want to return back to Natalia's point about Eucharist as being only going to Mass. And sometimes I think not just our practices, but our actual theology can be negative. Like it can have some negative consequences. And I've had messages multiple times over these months of people writing to me and saying, can you provide me some resources to give to my parents or to so-and-so, because they don't believe me that it's okay to stay home and stay away. And this just happened this weekend to me from multiple people, because El Paso now has the highest rate of positive numbers in the country, of a city over 400,000. And so people were writing to me and saying, can you send me those resources? I know you've sent them in the past. Or do you think that the diocese is going to make some sort of public statement again saying we don't need to be in Mass, even if all of the special protocols are happening? But when we're talking about life and death and pro-life issues, this is a pro-life issue. To be able to do other things and still claim our Catholic identity and not have the gravity of a mortal sin put upon us because we cannot participate physically in Eucharistic celebrations, I think is really important. So it's really important to rethink those and to share that information, that it's not the absolute worst thing to do during this time to stay home, and that these issues are also pro-life issues.
That's really lovely, Naomi. I think that also kind of that our parishes can be and have been in many places have been so. I mean, you know, parish life as always is uneven, and but in some places, you know, there are multiple volunteers and people involved in the parish who are checking on every person in the parish. There are places where where all kinds of activities are appearing online. And for people to participate in, and I think that that's the way that our parishes can be hubs, places where people can get even to volunteering. The other night at one parish, people asked, well, so I really want to do service, but my health doesn't permit me going outside. What can I do? I was like, you know what? My sister-in-law is tutoring online. I mean, there's actually lots of opportunities, and our parishes can be kind of hubs, because they're, at least in the places where there are trusted, I'm aware of what Darius said about trust, that then people think, okay, I can go with what they're recommending. So, and Darius, I also feel what you said about not just the gap between clergy and lay people sometimes in providing, innovative ways to do church, but sometimes the generational gap. I think of my own kind of discomfort sometimes with social media, whereas somebody who's 20 years younger than me can just intuitively knows what's going on and can help people connect through it, and I'm like, oh.
I still don't understand Twitter, Brett, but I get on there, I throw stuff out, I'm like, it happens. But I also, and I'm super bad at this, absolutely terrible, but I think we need to start envisioning other possibilities that don't include the internet, because as to how we're doing, so going back to Natalia's point about parishes being the hub of social services, but also how do we do things and have people experience sacramental life that doesn't necessarily include the internet, because not everybody has access, and not just that people aren't comfortable, but not everybody has access to a computer or Wi-Fi in their house, or the best Wi-Fi in their house. So I think those pieces are all important to think about. Again, I'm the worst.
I think we're entering into a really interesting moment where this is all going to be compounded as we get closer to the holidays. And those experiences tend to circle around specific liturgical celebrations, but also communal celebrations of family and relatives and friends. And in many places in the country, we are not going to be able to gather in that same way. And so if parishes haven't started making that turn to think very creatively about how they're going to be able to celebrate in a time when it's very difficult to feel like celebrating anything, let alone to gather and be together, we're going to end up spending some really, really hard holidays separated from one another. And it can't just be, by virtual internet. There are some places around the country, weather permitting, where they're finding open spaces and just gathering, in small groups and doing faith sharing. People are trying to figure out, particularly with some of the young adult groups I know, how to do caroling, and how do you do where you spread everybody out, 10 feet from each other, but can still go and bring some of that Christmas cheer. We're going to have to start planning for that creativity now, because we're less than a month away from Thanksgiving. Christmas is there, and everything in between, Guadalupe, Immaculate Conception, all of these things that we've just taken for granted suddenly are off the table, and we have to reimagine them in very different ways.
The other thing, I'm sorry, Claudia, one little thing that I want to throw in here is I like to throw these theology bombs and then see what happens. But hasn't this whole virtual being church on little screens and little boxes, the way I'm seeing you guys and people are seeing us right now, hasn't that just awakened in us a new appreciation of incarnation, right? And what it means to be incarnate. Like, I hate teaching online because I need my students physically present. I need to share a room with them. And as we approach the holidays, what Darius is saying, so much of what makes the holidays special is that sharing of material life that you don't get through a screen. So we are going to have to be really creative, right? One thing that popped into my head just as you were talking is like, why don't we do more serenatas, where we're like, for old people who are by themselves at Thanksgiving, if you could drop a meal off, or if you could like get a parish going, a sign up or whatever, where you could drop off a meal and sing a song from a window or something to wave so that they feel like they're part of a community. I think we're going to need to rediscover these popular religious practices and sort of re-engage them as ways to build incarnational community when we cannot have proximity.
I think I want to grab onto what you're saying, Natalia. We have a question from one of our audience members that I think you were beginning to answer it, and I want to encourage the rest of the panelists to enter into this conversation. They wanted to know, they said, I would like to hear more about reevaluating how we understand the sacrament of Eucharist. And I think you were going in that direction, this idea of incarnation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to say, let me start with what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the sacramental ministry is not important. And I am not saying that the real presence doesn't exist. So if you're going to send hate mail about that, just save it and find something else. It's fine. I am saying that the Eucharist, right, the Thanksgiving meal, quite literally, that Jesus shares with his closest friends, is something that we memorialize at Mass. But it is not the only place where we have shared life and sacrifice in that way. And I think that given that sacramental Eucharist is dangerous, actively dangerous in a pandemic with an airborne spread, we are going to need to figure out ways to have shared life and sacrifice and service that do not involve the touching and the gathering and the singing and the praying aloud, which endangers the most vulnerable among us. So that's where I'm going to start, and then I'm going to let my colleagues take over.
So the question was, they'd like to hear more about reevaluating how we understand the sacrament of Eucharist. Does anybody else like to take a stab at this question?
So some of the work that I do, and you'll see the images behind me, are on nursing Madonnas. So the sharing of breast milk and the incarnational piece of that. But the core for me about that research is how Eucharistic it is. It is the sharing of life with each other, quite literally nourishing and growing and feeding new life. That Mary is doing for Jesus, that mothers do for children, that hopefully we can do for one another. And so when we think about Eucharist, I think that's a framework to think from, that I pull from these images that I like so much and research. So people send them to me, but that's not a plug. You don't need to send any, but it's just something that I've thought about for years, about what are the most basic things that we do as humans for each other. And I think it's something Natalia was getting at, of how do we share meals when our main shared meal as Catholics is taken from us, and our other possibilities maybe need to be reformulated. So family gatherings or gatherings of loved ones are many times of so-and-so brings the pie, and so-and-so brings the ham, and so-and-so brings the tamales. And I am desperately trying to find pan de muerto right now. So, because the other piece is that without being able to travel, depending on where people are in the country, access to some of these things is very limited as well. And so people who are migratory and moving is something that I've been thinking about in how we think about how are we Eucharistic people every single day? How do we share, grow, nurture life? And like Darius was saying about parish life being fragile, I think all of life is fragile, and it shows up in parish life. That's exciting to me. Not so much that parish life is fragile, but that shows up. That shows that we are so concentrated somehow in tune to being with life that the fragility is shown in many different ways.
Yeah, so that's beautiful. I think too, you know, that sense of shared vulnerability is so broad, but it's also so hard. It's so against kind of the ethos of our society, where, you know, you're supposed to be together and powerful, and you can do anything you want. And but I was thinking about the eschatological aspect of Eucharist. You know, that we gather together, but we recognize it's always imperfect. It's never as good as we'd like. And, you know, until we all gather together at the end. And as a way of kind of blessing these partial measures and you know, socially distanced gatherings and encounters with one another that are not what we would like to, as a kind of a recognition of our limits and vulnerability, and that you know, that full presence of Christ is there even in limited circumstances as we move towards the reign of God.
I also think too, at the end of the liturgy, we always talk about the importance of that being sent. And we're not always good at that commissioning piece, or living out that commissioning piece. And I think this more than ever is a good reminder that the creativity that we're being called to ask for is exactly that of going out into the world and being in people's lives. And I always think of the Eucharist as the food for the journey. Well, the journey right now may not physically let us go very far, but it doesn't mean that the impact and the reach is not there. Some of the most Eucharistic spaces I've been in the last 7 months have been gathering with young adults and talking about the challenges and issues that we have in our lives. The breaking of bread, you know, it's not physical but virtual, and yet we're sharing our stories, we're sharing our challenges and our concerns, and in many cases, you know, it doesn't replace the sacrament, but it doesn't mean that that doesn't have a sacramental nature to it. And in many ways, there are opportunities in these spaces to share in ways that we can't do in the liturgy, that we can't do in the Eucharist, because the participation is different. The call to participation is very different. And I think we have to recognize that, you know, if we've leaned on the liturgy as sort of the only way that we gather and share Eucharist, not only have we limited it, we've also now said it can only take place in this space, you know, in this time, rather than recognizing this is meant to go out into the world and be something that we can share with those who are and are not part of our faith community. And so I think for me, the possibilities, I think, are endless if we see this as a real sense of being sent out, rather than trying to stay in and figure out, well, how do we make it work within these limitations? If anything, the limitations are only there based on what we put in front of us as an obstacle.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you all for your enlightening comments. We have a few questions that are along the same lines, and I think that I'd like to present it to the panelists. And in my experience in adult formation and in leadership formation, it comes up all the time, and it's coming up again right now. Kind of the discrepancies between the laity wanting to take on their leadership, to take on their baptismal vocation, to go out, like you were saying, Darius, but then juxtaposed to perhaps established leadership or clergy who insist on maintaining a certain way of being, and many times kind of shutting down their desires to think creatively or to go outside the parish walls. And I think some of what's being revealed in the questions that our audience is presenting is a frustration, or perhaps they think that this pandemic has kind of revealed that to another degree, especially within communities who just want to get back to normal. So how what can be done? What would be some of your advice for these people who want to think creatively the way that you're proposing, but that are faced with some of these obstacles?
One thing I would, sorry, did you want to go, Darius?
Go ahead.
I was thinking that, I mean, apropos to what you said, Claudia, you know, as Catholics, we sometimes have a hard time getting out of that hierarchical mentality, even when we don't need to be in it. And I think about, you know, all the things that we can do without requiring the permission of the parish leader, or without branding it as something that the parish is doing. You know, I mean, there's probably hundreds of small faith communities around the country and neighborhoods that are only are loosely connected to parishes, but where people are doing very creative things to take care of one another right now. And you know, sometimes we try things under the aegis of the parish with sort of the, you know, the old motto of it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission sometimes.
I think those limitations too, I think this becomes one of the things where our practice, I think, will lead people or invite people to want to learn more. And so if we're going out and sharing the good news that we've experienced during this time, people are going to follow up and say, well, where do you go to church? You know, what community are you from? And sometimes we might be better representatives of our communities than if somebody showed up to Mass on Sunday. And I think I struggle with that as a young adult, in interacting with lots of other young adults who are not church or who are not participating in church. The Mass is a hard thing to invite people to engage in and understand, because there's so much context that you have to really understand everything that's going on. And so I think one of the gifts in this moment is we can create different spaces to answer some of those more basic questions that young people are struggling with, whether it's identity, whether it's those big taboo questions that we never want to talk about in church, you know, sexuality and politics and current issues. Like maybe those are some of the spaces that we need to create safe spaces for those conversations. And then that can lead to an invitation to the larger community. But I think right now, anybody who has a space, a platform, relationships, because at the heart of all of it, it's relationship. You can do the work of being an ambassador of your parish community, of your faith community, without needing to have that official stamp of approval. And I guarantee you, in many cases, Father is not going to mind you bringing a new person to the community right now. You know, you might have concerns about bringing that person to your community, but most pastors, I think, are really, really looking for some hope in the midst of all of this. And I think some of that comes from inviting new people to discover it, because people are hungry for it.
I find a couple things really interesting, and there's a question in the question box talking about Natalia's April article in Commonweal, and about having kind of lay people being part of teaching homiletics, etc. And if we've seen any of this. So I've been worshiping with a community that came together. It's a transnational community since Easter. It kind of started at Easter and then has just been going. And there's a shared homily there, shared reflection. And when people started having more and more questions during the homily, it did start with a priest, with Gilberto Cavazos Gonzalez, who's both a friar and a spiritual theologian. But they then started a Bible study too. And so the people are meeting on Saturday and having Lectio Divina and coming to Mass on Sunday and sharing that with the community and doing that bilingually. It's a Spanish, English mostly. Sometimes there's 5 or 6 languages, but it's such just an interesting engagement to see, and to see how naturally that has come forward. So I think that's fascinating. The other thing that is really fascinating to me is the amount of information that is being created. How many lay ministers, scholars, people who are really well educated in theology, Catholic theologies, and so many other theologies are out doing these kinds of things all over the place. Like I'm so overwhelmed because I want to watch everything. I have some serious FOMO. I call it the Zoominar FOMO because it's just too much. But there's so much that I think it's a time for people to think about these as other ways of, maybe you engage one of these videos and have a conversation on it, or put something together too as your own people. What are the questions that are coming forward? So yeah, I think there's just so many possibilities right now.
Just as an example to that, Naomi, we found many of our members at NFCYM were really struggling with how to talk about the issue of race and racism within the organization. And so we reached out internally to some of our folks and said, could we do some webinars on just how to talk about race and racism during this time? The response was overwhelming, to the point where we planned for one webinar. We ended up doing 3 because we had so many questions and so many people who were engaged in the conversation. As the person blessed to moderate that was very much kind of sacred space and sacred language, just based on what people were sharing, the vulnerability that people brought to the conversation. That in many ways was a sacramental moment. And so I think that's an opportunity for us to think just differently and more broadly about how can we be engaging in church and engaging in faith and engaging our teaching. These were catechetical moments and also spiritual moments, and it all happened out of the necessity of this moment. And I think that's the kind of creativity we really need to invite people to.
It's kind of a great moment, isn't it, of cross-fertilization, where people are learning about things they've never seen before, never heard about. And that's good for our parishes, because people will bring those things back and say, hey, and Darius, I think that's a great example. It's so compelling right now that we need to have these conversations about race and racism, but people are so terrified. How do we do this? Or they've never seen it happen in a successful way, or they've only seen it happen in a divisive way. But then, now they look at something somewhere else and go, hey, yeah, we could do this. This is possible, because, so much of our experience is shaped by what seems possible or impossible in our local context.
One thing that this conversation, which by the way is filling me with hope, like I'm just so much more hopeful now than I was at the beginning of this, is to notice how, to my mind, the Holy Spirit continues to direct the attention of the church to that which the builders rejected, right? So the Facebook presence that you thought was stupid that the church had because it was whatever, just for the kids or whatever. It turns out that the people who were paying attention to that were better positioned to respond more quickly and more thoroughly to the pandemic. The people who you thought were just, the computer nerds who were kind of, they were just really good at this stuff, but not necessary or integral to the parish life, ended up becoming the center of the parish life. Those devotional practices that you may have thought were like a little bit out there or whatever, suddenly become the lifeline that's holding you to your faith, right? We've all been pushed into this quasi-monastic life where we are trapped indoors with some of us with our family and some alone. Up to you which one is better. They're different on different days. We are rediscovering the tiniest pleasures, like I went out for a walk today in nature. It was beautiful. It helped me keep my sanity, right? All of these things that we have overlooked, that we have kind of discarded as irrelevant or somehow less important, have now once again been moved by the Holy Spirit to the center of our faith. And I can't help but think that not that the pandemic is of God or like the silver linings or whatever. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying instead is that this is, this crucible is a moment of invitation to see what aspects of our faith lives we've been ignoring or thinking are less important, or what members of our community we didn't realize were living alone and might be struggling, or are struggling with a debilitating illness that we didn't know about. It's an invitation to turn our gaze that way. And I think that that's a really sort of powerful lesson that we can take away from this moment.
But I think it has a lot to do with the notion of fasting. I did not appreciate fasting in the way that I appreciate fasting now, and what that looks like and what that means, that we have to fast every single day in very tangible and concrete ways. I have not hugged my parents in 7 months. I have not, there's all so many things. I had 2 former students come visit me last week, and I'm like, you can stay away over there in my house, but we're going to order in and we'll share a meal. But sharing that meal was so deep in ways that before was just so taken for granted. But now, because of fasting for so long, the joy that comes from that. So you talking about taking a walk, Natalia, that really for me highlights our theological notion of fasting.
I think also to let us be sad, to lament the things that we've lost. Our society is so much about achievement, and we just sometimes have no place for grief, or or a grief that is simultaneously at home with hope. That's part of our Paschal faith, that we believe you can be crucified and rise, that our parishes can be crucified and rise. And I think I've had to be kind of convinced to let my students kind of grieve and mope and lament a little bit, and not always be Mr. Chipper, Southern California.
Thank you. It is quite common, right? We're always talking about the future of the church, the future of the church. And these past 7 months, it would seem at times that it's completely changed the trajectory. But I'm wondering, do you think that it has changed the trajectory? Were we always headed in this direction? And what's here to stay? What should stay?
I think it's accelerated some of the changes that we're starting. So it accelerated polarization. If you were barely hanging on, just going to mass out of obligation, like it probably cut you loose. If you were dragging your teenager to mass, the teenager got cut loose. So it accelerated processes that were probably already underway. But in terms of what is here to stay, one thing that I hope is here to stay is what Brett was saying about the rediscovery of lamentation, right? The rediscovery of the Psalms, really, in all of their emotional spectrum, right? The imprecatory Psalms, the lamentation Psalms, the calls for justice, the anti-cultus prophetic passages that decry sort of bad liturgy or self-righteousness. I hope that we can rediscover that and allow that to be at home in our faith, and hold that kind of dialectic, that we can be a people of hope without rushing through lamentation, that we can have a moment to pause and look at the lives that were lost, the normal that was lost, and to mourn with God that reality. That's what I hope we keep.
I really do love that part about the lamentation. I'm a super fan of Nuestra Señora de Dolores as well, but the song Santa Maria del Camino is so strong with "we accompany Mary, we accompany God." The notion that we see God in everyone else, and we need to accompany everyone else in that sense, our Imago Dei. I think that needs to continue to remain strong front and center, and attending to who is suffering. Some people are like, I'm so overwhelmed because all I see are things from Black Lives Matter and who is being killed by police and the hypermilitarization and people who are seeking asylum and being kept in the detention centers or not being allowed in to the country. And these are all people's lives. And I do hope we continue to keep attending to all of those pieces and paying attention more closely to other people's lives, even though I think it is easier to maybe just turn on Netflix and shut it all out many days. But it's kind of so everywhere that it's hard to to ignore anymore. And I hope that actually stays, because I hope we transform that, not that the suffering stays.
I think one of the things that I would like to see, and I hope I'll see continue, is are churches being spaces that offer space for prophetic dialogue. And so what do I mean by that? To talk about the things that are really relevant and really important issues, but to create space where we can encounter one another and encounter these experiences. I've had so many fruitful and genuine conversations in this time when we couldn't gather. I think partly because people felt comfortable, more comfortable at home than they would in front of a group of people. But also it's opened up spaces that just weren't there before, that we just hadn't thought of or used before. And so prophetic dialogue, I think, really invites us to listen to the other, to others, and especially within the church right now. I think that that need is there. But then to really say, how do we incorporate what we're hearing into our pastoral response, into our lived discipleship in the world? And I call attention to Cardinal Bernardine and his call to be Catholic speech 25 years ago. If you haven't read it, I recommend it, because it sounds like it could have been written yesterday. And yet, when you talk about the polarization, when you talk about the tough issues that we need to talk about, everything is reflected in there. And I think this is a moment for our parishes to be spaces that allow for those important conversations to take place, because it's happening, and it's not necessarily happening in our four walls, in our parish spaces right now. But I think our communities have opened up room to have those important conversations.
On the issue of polarization, I heard something recently that I found kind of surreal, but maybe speaks to this. But where there's a cathedral in the Midwest where they had a number of people that would not wear masks at Mass. So they put them all in the same section in the back. I don't know what to make of that or how to talk about it, but I do see that at least there's some attempt to find a way to bridge. The trajectory I'm more interested in is this kind of a focus that we've had for a long time, worrying about people disaffiliating, especially young people, and the lessening of mass attendance, almost to the point sometimes of it becoming kind of a moral panic that the world is going to crumble around us. And I hope what this does is changes the trajectory of our attention to that a little bit, that the solutions can't all be in the parish, they can't all be around parish renewal programs. There has to be more attention to the way that people pray and live at home, the way that people, catechize within their families, and all those things, many of which, are already happening in beautiful places all around. And some of them have come from Latin America in a very powerful way. But I hope that the trajectory changes a little bit and that we're more attentive to those.
I want to thank you all so much for sharing this hour with us. I'd like to invite everyone at home to join me in a moment of a spiritual appreciation. I know we can't clap together, but I'd like to thank Naomi Deanda, the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at University of Dayton, Brett Hoover, Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University, Natalia Imperatori-Lee, Professor of Religious Studies, Manhattan College, and Darius Villalobos, Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry. I'd like to thank Commonweal for hosting this series of 4 gatherings, which will be available on the website. Please visit. And to thank all of you for joining us for these important conversations.